Pokemon TCG is at an all-time high in terms of both interest in the game and tournament attendance. Attendance records keep shattering year after year, barrier to entry is at an all-time low, and the game is actually fun. But it's that last point I really want to talk about today. Is the Pokemon TCG actually that fun right now? There is a lot to get into, of course, so let's just get started. When determining if the Pokemon TCG is actually fun or not, the format at the time is always the most important point of consideration. The available card pool determines everything from how creative you can be, what's tournament viable, and what it takes to be or beat the meta. But in this format, one deck is so much stronger than everything else that considering other options is hardly required. One so powerful that even before rotation it was still incredible, but after the extinction or crippling of every meta deck from back then, Dragapult EX stands alone. At about 50% of tournament usage, Dragapult decks are not only dominating the game, but they're so good that the second best deck isn't even remotely close to it in power level. Dragapult has too many tools in its favor, from Phantom Dive's immense power and damage spread potential, to Dracloak being one of the best draw engines in the format as a pre-evolution, incredible consistency item cards, and disruption cards like Crushing Hammer, Badoo, Unfair Stamp, and Special Red Card. It's the only deck that has everything a deck could want, and also the only deck that doesn't lose to anything. Sure, it might have some slightly unfavored matchups here or there, but overall the deck can consistently beat anything you throw at it. So in a format like this one, or the Silver Tempest Lugia V-Star format, the best move is usually just to play the BDIF because you can't get that power anywhere else. But another common strategy in these so-called Tier 0 formats is to build a deck that hard counters the BDIF, or best deck in format, hoping to farm it enough times in a row to win a tournament. A perfect example of this was at NAIC this year, where James Kowalski breezed past a ton of Dragapult players to win the entire tournament. But what if I told you that this doesn't even work against Dragapult? Even All-Out Blitzel's NAIC winning Lily's Clefairy slot box deck struggles into some Dusknoir builds of Dragapult, Team Rocket's Watchtower as a card generally, and it still has real lose conditions thanks to Crushing Hammer. In other words, even a deck that was built to hard counter Dragapult doesn't even beat it 70% of the time. Dragapult is just too good. It wins no matter how hard you try to farm it. Another problem with Dragapult right now is how it can gatekeep some decks from seeing higher levels of success. Festival Lead is honestly a really strong deck, even stronger now thanks to Gladion's Final Battle, but its poor Dragapult matchup keeps it from being that good. Alakazam decks are forced to entirely build in order to disrupt Dragapult's energies to even have a chance in that matchup. But Pult has so many lines to come back or just disrupt Alakazam that the matchup is still a bit uphill nowadays. Now, I'm not saying I want Festival Lead and Alakazam to be broken or S tier. I unironically think that could be worse for the health of the game, but what I do want is some more parity, more viable deck options that don't require centering in on one overpowered behemoth that dictates every deck building decision. Is this card good against Dragapult? If not, it might not be worth playing in my deck. I do think though that of all the Tier 0 decks to have, Dragapult might be one of the healthiest of them all. Now obviously its usage right now is not healthy, but I'm saying that the deck definitely can be in this format if other powerful decks could help keep it in check or lower its power level. Pult is hard to play optimally, extremely skill based in how it operates in most matchups, and it rewards the best players for building and playing it well. A deck like say Goldengo, however, could reward about anyone for playing it however they want oftentimes, because that deck inherently had more variance and less skill expression than Dragapult's customizable damage and recon directive decisions. Now, this comes back to the question as to whether the format is actually fun, and personally, I don't think so. Having played regularly through the Silver Tempest Lugia format as well as this one, I think the Lugia format was definitely worse, but it's like Alien versus Predator. No matter who wins, we lose. Dragapult might genuinely be ruining the Pokemon TCG right now, but the format being unenjoyable doesn't automatically mean that it's bad. Let's now shift our attention to a key factor of format health, how much skill actually matters. Obviously, skill is more important than luck astronomically in the Pokemon TCG, especially in best of 3 tournaments. But some formats are objectively more skill reliant than others, all because of the card pool and flexibility of top decks. A format like 2017 felt enjoyable because the game regularly rewarded you for playing well and punished you for playing bad. The top decks could be hard to pilot, resource management was incredibly strict, and the Pokemon generally felt like their power levels were pretty similar. Of course, there were top tier decks like the Garbodor archetypes, but these decks generally were healthier for the metagame. This format though was much slower than most, with 2 shots being the most common form of taking prizes, healing cards like Acerola and weakness on Pokemon being more relevant, and turbo item cards were inherently kept in check checked by Garbodor's Trashalanche attack. Not to mention the ample comeback potential provided by the other Garbodor's ability lock combined with End's late game hand disruption similar to Iono. But comparing this to a format like 2022's Silver Tempest format or even today's format, games are much faster now. Lugia games could genuinely last 4 turns on average, with 1 turn to set up, the next to evolve into Archeops and take 2 prizes, and the final 2 to close out the game. In today's format, Dragapult does operate a little slower than Lugia did, but it can still win games in 3 attacks pretty consistently, often in 5 turns thanks to its spread damage, and the other quote-unquote meta decks like Alakazam, Festival Lead, and Slot Box decks are all extremely fast and aggressive decks that aim to race you to 6 prizes first. This format does feel inherently less skill intensive than even the Ascended Heroes pre-rotation format in general, especially since most of the non-Dragapult decks are extremely linear. But obviously Dragapult itself isn't just non-linear, it's one of the most intuitively skill-intensive decks in recent years. But in my opinion, unless you're playing Dragapult, skill feels a bit less relevant to your tournament success. A perfect example is how Crustle has been performing recently, a deck that is entirely matchup fishy and only wins by your opponent having few answers to it. This deck obviously does take some skill to play, like, you know, every deck in Pokemon history, but its skill ceiling is closer to the basement ceiling than the roof of the house. However, Dragapult isn't without its problems in this regard either, especially in the oh-so-common mirror match. Between the opening coin flip, early game Badoo Wars, crushing hammer coin flips, unfair stamp, and potentially mind-bend confusion coin flips, variance is definitely the defining factor in most high-level Dragapult mirror matches. To be fair, most mirror matches are like this for a lot of decks, but when 50% of the room is playing the same deck and the mirror match is inherently high variance, mirror matches matter a lot more, hence the crushing hammer meta. I think another massive problem with this format is that all of the new decks being released from sets like Chaos Rising or Pitch Black are not strong enough to compete with Dragapult, yes, but are also extremely linear. For example, Mega Excadrill and Hide and Sneak from Pitch Black are both stupidly one-dimensional decks that do the exact same thing every game and just kind of hope it works. Both can sometimes beat Dragapult, especially some variants of Dragapult, but sometimes isn't really enough in this format. So, funnily enough, Dragapult feels like one of the healthiest decks in this format in a vacuum. But since everything else sucks compared to it, its usage is so high that it becomes about as unhealthy as the rest of the pack, if not even more unhealthy. If you can't tell already, I personally don't like this format. Games feel too linear for a lot of decks and a lot of matchups, deck building innovations are too centralized around Dragapult, and the mid-tier decks feel low agency and kind of stale. And I think stale is really the perfect word to describe this format. Dragapult has been the only good deck since day 1 of rotation, and unless Pokemon wants to print some game-breaking threat in either Delta Rain or our January special set, it's probably not changing anytime soon. The gameplay of the Pokemon TCG in general is fun, but the same can't really be said about its only tournament-supported format. And I'm not gonna lie, the same kind of applies to Expanded, even though the West doesn't have official tournaments for it. So while statistically the Pokemon TCG isn't dying right now, I wouldn't be surprised if it starts to soon. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed, please consider subscribing. It would mean the world to me. Anyways, take care. Have a good one. Bye.